We are a community that comes together and works together. And these are the things that we want to talk about, Springfield to the nation, not the things that we have to keep telling the press like, hey, your pets are safe in Springfield, Ohio. They absolutely are. It's crazy I have to keep saying that.
Hi, I'm Anna Marie Cox. This is 90 Days with Anna Marie Cox, where we count down how many days are left to the election. 47 days. If you live in a place that has a very strict voter rights registration cutoff, you only have 17 days to register. Please register to vote. This is a show where we talk to smart people about what's happening in this wild, unprecedented, historic, topsy-turvy election. And today I'm talking to Angelo Carusone, who is the president of Media Matters for America, president CEO.
Yeah, same. I think it's the same.
All right.
President.
Well, Mr. President, what's top of mind for you lately? Like, what are you seeing in this very, like, multiple viewpoint election? You know, social, conservative, liberal, like all, you know, credentialed media. What are you seeing in that landscape that you want to talk about?
I think for me, the thing that I would start with is that a lot of the parallels between what happened in the information landscape, which is the angle that I look at it from, which is the terrain that all things take place in, right? Politics, these political campaigns, local fights, culture debates, they all take place in what the media is shaping. And when I look at the landscape right now, the thing that's top of mind to me is that it increasingly reaffirms one of the concerns that I had heading into this, is that the landscape is much more like it was in 2015 and 2016 than it was in 2020. And by that, I mean that there's a lot more vulnerability to disinformation, a lot more susceptibility to really intentional disinformation efforts, whether they be domestic or foreign. And I think, weirdly enough, that we took for granted in 2020 how much had actually changed between 2016 and 2020 and the 2020 election. And every time I look at the morning memos that we produce or start to look at the landscape, it just reinforces that we are in an environment right now where it's almost like everything has been reset and there's not a lot of antibodies in the system. And I see a continued pieces of evidence that reaffirm that. Even in the last week, the stuff that happened, the storyline around Springfield reaffirms how quickly something can be manufactured, get uplift, get amplification from both domestic sources that had no friction in the system, including a platform that was very willing to promote it. And then obviously some foreign efforts to help boost and amplify it, and how it could just run away. And when I apply that to voting, I start to get really worried because a lot of the speed bumps have been taken off the road, and a lot of the antibodies are out of the system. So for me, that's top of mind, that the last week really affirmed for me that assessment.
So that's interesting, because one of the things that we've been talking about on this show is the separation of credentialed media from other kinds of media, and then also specifically social media, what the kids are up to, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
Your TikToks and your Reels, which I consume a lot of, but still I'm an old, and how the Harris campaign actually has been incredibly skilled in incubating ideas in that sphere, and how that has been a real playground for targeting disinformation in some ways, like paying attention to, I think, not paying attention to that stuff. But on the other hand, I think the landscape you're talking about is a lot of the credentialed media, which has, yes, turned out to have learned very, very little.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that distinction, because I think it's critical, is that, and obviously when it comes to the large information landscape, in a way, it all sort of blurs together. And so in a way, if something's really, really bad and harmful in one segment, it does spill over to affect the other. And to your point, one thing that is uniquely different about what the Harris campaign has done is that they have managed to find a way to not just harness it, because they're not in control of it, but to leverage it and to reinforce it and to help support it. And what they really understood is that so much of what happens on social media, it's about social currency. And one of the things that Trump did well, and the larger Republican space, Musk too, is that they know that, if I'm just a regular user who creates memes or produces content, I know there's a chance Donald Trump will retweet me. right? I know there's a chance, and I just have to produce enough of it and share enough of it to him that he will then take it and spread it. And there's a currency there that incentivizes people to both act, it reinforces an existing amplification imperative that exists on the right. I mean, Rush Limbaugh taught 40 million Americans for decades that they should be ditto heads, take the things that he says and echo them back out into the world. And what the right wing did in particular, Trump and sort of the larger part there, is that they reinforced that with a currency. And if you look at Biden's feed or even Nancy Pelosi's feed, top Democrats' feed, they never retweet anyone. And it sounds so insignificant, but it's not. Because what it does is it says that there's no benefit to doing anything. You won't ever get that high level amplification. You can only speak to a small echo chamber. But they did. They gave it a wink and a nod. They produced content that's directly fed into that and responsive to what those small segments are doing. And it's more than just excitement and energy, which is valuable as a political tool because you could harness that to get people out to vote. To your point, it does something else. It puts antibodies in the system. It makes it a lot harder to spread lies because they then take those lies and respond to them. And that's the important part when you're dealing with misinformation, disinformation. It's not fact checking. It's not like, oh, you got the percentage wrong. It's the narrative. It's the story that people walk away with when they hear it. And so having a very active and energized audience online, in particular, whether they be young people or not, it does make it a lot harder for the harms of those disinformation efforts to sort of affect individuals. They still have potential real consequences. I'm very worried about how those disinformation efforts can then be applied to, say, the mechanics of voting, and sort of helping create conditions where it's harder for people to vote one way or the other. But it is a bright spot in the larger landscape, and they've been very wise to tap into that.
I think if we want to use a geographic metaphor, I don't think it's maybe correct to say to put the mainstream media, credentialed media in the middle exactly, right? Like they're not moderate. But what I do think of is like the biggest mass, right? Like that's a huge, huge pile of stuff. And then we have, the conservative right-wing media sphere and the more progressive alternative media sphere. And the thing about what I think you're describing is that the way that Democrats have used that left-wing media sphere is to just deposit into it, right? And what's happening this cycle that's kind of cool is that it's gotten really excited. Like once it's deposited into, right? Like there's a lot of excitement and energy. And I do think it's drawn up a little bit too, in the sense that the feral 25-year-olds on the Harris social media team, for one, have been unfettered by approval stuff, right? Like I read a really interesting piece where they talked about the approval process for putting like a new TikTok or a reel out has just become, for them, there's not like a whole like layer, right?
Yeah.
And that's really cool and that's really exciting. But on the right, it's just been happening for so long and it's much more of a circle. It's much more seamless, right?
It is. And it totally is. And I think to that, the two things that I would note there, one is this.
And they pollute, they both work their way into that middle.
They do.
But the mainstream media has actually been paying more attention to that right wing for longer. And so it gets like scooped up.
And I think that, what's interesting about that on sort of from both of those vantage points is one of the things about this election that is wild to consider, and it ties into what you're saying about the right wing, is that this is the first time in 30 years, first presidential election in 30 years, where Rush Limbaugh is not the single largest get out the vote operation in the country. I mean, and the significance of that is more than just about Limbaugh. It's actually to get to the larger point that you were making about the right-wing media, because it's not just that they're right-wing media, they have these different properties and entities that can project, that because they had a Limbaugh and a Fox News, they had a center of gravity. And what that meant is that they could then, that is how the echo chamber became, that was the echo, is that they would sort of be the agenda setters, the larger media apparatuses would reinforce that narrative over and over and over again. It would reach such a level of saturation that it could not be ignored by both other parts of the media landscape, both the mainstream media, right, and then also to the extent there is a more left-leaning media that would then respond. So then everything is always on their terms. And that had been the cycle over and over and over again. And one of the things that's happened now is that, and you sort of see this play out in all the skirmishes, is that there is no center of gravity in the right-wing media. They're a chorus without a conductor. So they still are bigger and louder and scarier, but they're very disorderly. They don't have the ability to echo in the same way that they did before. And that means that narrative dominance is not as easy for them to attain. They still have a lot of the muscle memory and that inertia, and that gives them incredible advantages. But there's a real vulnerability and weakness there as compared to previous cycles, simply because there is no center of gravity. Tucker was beginning to move into that role, but then he lost his spot on Fox. And probably the closest they have maybe is a Musk, but even then, it's just pockets of influence. There is nothing that says, I'm the conductor, here's the agenda setting. And to your other point about the left wing, which is interesting, I mean, think about what they did with Project 2025, which, you had something that is somewhat esoteric and unknown, innocuous naming, and a lot of complicated policy, 900-page book. And, it took the right wing months when they started to demonize DEI. It took them months for it to bubble up enough just to start to get some saturation. Whereas if you look at what happened with Project 2025, from the start of the real efforts where the campaign was beginning to reinforce things that were already beginning to percolate in sort of these online circles, it was about 6 weeks before 60% of the country was aware of Project 2025. I mean, that's crazy.
Well, it also got covered in people.
Bingo. Yep. The same mechanics worked. They made so much energy and noise through so many different, and they cut across so many different demographic segments, potential audience segments, that various parts of that other media apparatus, the more traditional mainstream, couldn't ignore it either. And they saw an incentive structure in talking about it because it gave them something to tap into in these online circles. So it was, I think, a real story of the so what, or the success of having what some days feels like just a Schadenfreude sort of posts that are enjoyable. It's like, but what's the point? It's like, well, the point is that the underlying structure that allows for them to do those Schadenfreude posts and get that content, it also means that they can project and tell a story in a way that we just haven't been able to do for a very long time.
Yeah, and that's like the genius of the whole weird thing, which is like, it's not weird, just the story that gets told with weird, because it does come with the story, is this is weird and dangerous. This is not just like, this is this is not just that it's strange to be interested in women's periods. It's dangerous. It's creepy. It's wanting to control these things. It's weird as a threat to democracy. Like I live in Austin, and as you probably know, "Keep Austin Weird" is a beloved slogan here.
Yeah.
So I'm a little defensive about using the word weird, although I think it in context works, but creepy, I think, is the better term. Like what we're talking about. I
totally get it. Yeah, I'm the same. I'm a little bit. I live in DC, but I think my heart is in San Francisco, and it's a similar sort of thing where I feel like all my friends we proudly consider ourselves weird, and that's basically how we've described ourselves for a long time. And when that became the main story, I'm like, wait a minute, not all weird is bad. Now I don't want to be like that. Like, it's an uphill climb. I'm just gonna have to embrace it and not try to tell people that there's a better term. Although I wish I could. But I'm with you on the same page that it is the story that's underneath that is what is resonating, and that's what works. But I totally empathize on the point about weird.
Let's go to actually a term that I also feel is kind of problematic, but has caught on, and so I'm kind of gonna surrender to it, which is sane washing, which I think gets us into this problem of the right and the mainstream media kind of feeding into each other in a way that the left has a hard time breaking in, which is the ways in which credentialed media is unprepared to cover someone who is Looney Tunes, right? Who is, his ability to make sense is as questionable as Biden's ever was. I'm talking about Trump, in case people are curious.
Yeah, right.
Talking about the presidential candidate for the Republican Party. When he goes on of one of these, nonsensical, unhinged rants and talks about the birds and the windmills, and he gets lost in a like talking about how many times it takes to flush the toilet, whatever. Hannibal Lecter, we all know. When the AP covers it, when the New York Times covers it, Parker Malloy, I think, former employee, a contributor, guest on the show, coined the term sane washing for how these credentialed media take what he says and like put it in a way that makes it sound sane. Like,
yes.
How do we interrupt that? Or like, what do you're the one who looks at this kind of the interaction of these things. Like, what do you see when that happens? And is there a way What do you want to ask of credentialed media to do it differently?
I mean, one of the things that I was asking them to do in the spring, and I think it would have prevented a lot of what became described as sandwashing as the summer went on, is I was asking reporters, including a lot of those writing stories day to day based off of pool reports or what they were seeing, to watch a full rally. And the reason why I said it was that is that I've watched at this point 634 of his rallies. So I've watched almost all of his speeches since 2016, since the 2016 campaign. And one of the things that I was trying to emphasize for reporters was that it's not the same. Not that it was fun in games back then, but that it is different. That there back then people thought it was like rambly, but a lot of times he was actually hitting the top points of different segments of right-wing media, and it was very clearly you could say, oh, he was telling a cohesive, coherent narrative, even if it sounded like nonsense. There was a through line to it, and it was much more cohesive, and it was less terrifying than it is now, which is disjointed and sort of disorienting and not responsive. And he does lose his ways, gets confused a lot. And one of the things I was saying is that they themselves were giving him too much credit, that they were reading into an impression that they had of him as sort of vigorous, and he moves a lot and he's loud, so therefore he's in perfect condition. And they were sort of making sense of what they were reading. And one of the examples that I was using when I was trying to push reporters to do that was to go back through the pool reports and to look at how many times when they were reading the pool reports, the pool reporter was writing rambles or says something, nonsense, whatever in the reports. It was a normal thing for Trump day to day. And at the time, it's like if you were reading a pool report about Biden, you would have written the story centered around the idea that the pool report had identified in his comments as rambly. But you've sort of so used to that you're injecting you're sort of processing in a way what he's saying and trying to make it seem much more coherent than it is, and you don't have to do that. And part of what I was getting to is that if they had seen him through a different lens, which is a full stretch of the full hour and 15 minutes, hour and 45 minutes, it would be so disconnected from what their impression was that it'd be a lot harder for them to rely on that process where they sort of make sense of the things that he's saying. And I think that's something that a lot of reporters who are still suffering from this should do. The second thing, though, I think is bigger, which is that I think that this has always benefited Trump, is that because he's such a character, in a way, people still treat him, even reporters, that he's like a WWE star, that there's kayfabe, that it's all an act. And that some of it is just, well, that's his shtick. That's how he presents himself, so it's okay. It's not any different than what he was doing historically. So I think the second thing that I think is needed is to not go after individual reporters. So first, I think the individual reporters need to challenge themselves to at least consume one full stretch, to sort of give themselves a palate cleanse. And I think the second, though, is at the editorial level, because a lot of it begins with at the arc of coverage. It gets into narrative stuff again. And when we did an analysis before Biden had dropped out, there was 10 times in the top papers. Top papers were 10 times more likely to cover Biden's age alone, ignoring the mental stuff, just talking about his age and his health. 10 times more likely to talk about Biden's age than Trump's age, even though they're about the same age, right? And by all measures, Trump is less healthy. But yet they still emphasize and fixated on Biden's age and health. And that's an editorial issue. That's not something that happens at the individual reporter level. That is a broad scale problem with their coverage. And that's something that papers can actually do to correct for. And I focus on papers here in particular because I think that they're the ones that are driving a lot of this narrative. I mean, they still are the ones where most news gets incubated and then everybody sort of comments on it. But I think that they were the ones that really need to reassess around it, both at the individual level and then at the editorial level. And I don't think that's happened on the latter, honestly.
I agree. And I think focusing on newspapers makes a lot of sense because although not very many people read them, it's a little like Velvet Underground. Like not a lot of people buy them, but they're very influential. The right people read them, right?
That's right.
I hate to make that comparison. Love Velvet Underground, but I do think something about that works. And I think you're also correct to talk about the systemic problem here with newspapers covering Biden more critically, covering the age, and let's distinguish between his age and mental faculties, because age is not the point. And they covered it as age, which really pissed me off.
That's exactly right.
Because it's not age. Like there are plenty of people who are in their 80s who are just sharp as a tack, right? Like no problem.
I mean, Larry
So
Ellison looks 50 years old. I mean, and he acts even like 40 years old. So I'm not,
Bernie Sanders is running around the Capitol.
Bernie Sanders. Exactly.
Elizabeth Warren. Anyway, let's not name a lot of old politicians that we like. But what happens is that the echoes of the systemic problem is what happens when you work the refs for decades.
Yeah.
Which is the right has worked the refs to the point where it is instinctual among mainstream credentialed outlets to make sure that they're critical of the Democrats, to just err on the side of criticism, because they don't want, it's not that any individual reporter wants to be criticized, right? Like, it's not an individual reporter is thinking, I must criticize Biden more than I criticize Trump. It's just muscle memory, habit, whatever. And then when the right is covered, it is covered through the lens of, well, I better be sure to be objective. And I will treat them as though they are normal.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will normalize these ideas just as if they were policy platforms to investigate, right? So probably the best example here is how immigration is covered. For one thing, it's called immigration. Like, when the right talks about it's talking about Haitian immigrants, right? And it's talking about building a wall to stem immigration. It's fucking racist, right? Like, that's what's happening. It's not, when they talk about immigration, they're not talking about immigration. They're talking about shithole countries and whatnot. And so is that going to take decades to undo? Like, I thought there was a breakthrough in 2016, but
there was the right ran the same playbook against the platforms to sort of work the refs, because this is where the new ball game was, and they did the same thing with Facebook, and we can go through all the examples there, but they basically made the same thing: cries of bias, hope the platforms inoculate themselves against those cries by sort of then privileging either their bad behavior or their misinformation or whatever, extremism. And I think there was a lot of progress leading into 2020, and then obviously COVID changed so much for people that the platform sort of rethink. The January 6th also reoriented a lot of the work that was done there. And to me, one of the things that's happened in the last 8 months or so is that most of the platforms have rolled back all of their protections around civic engagement, election disinformation, election misinformation. And it's, to me, an illustration that the work to unwind the damage is going to be more than just a few years or a few months of work. It's going to take decades. It's a larger systemic issue, and in some ways, it's a profession issue too, which is that I think sometimes I'm a critic, right? I'm a media watchdog, but the reason it's possible to even be a watchdog for this is that journalism is a profession. It has a set of standards, and you use those standards, those tools in the toolkit to ultimately get to a product. And that's the idea behind it, is that you're producing something based off of a set of tools, and the tools get assessed and refined, and they get, there's some norms. That's why people study it. It's a profession. And I don't think the profession as a whole has really navigated or dealt with what's happened to them as a result of the right wing working the refs in the 90s, the birth of Fox News to hammer away at the rest of the news media as sort of being left leaning and liberal. And that is something that is so deeply baked in now that it will take it's hard to even be aware of it. And the other challenge, and I think this is the thing about Trump that's so unique and also terrifying, is that, and the Republican Party these days more broadly, is that because they promise so much retribution and punishment against media outlets, in addition to this existing muscle memory that's there that will take a long time culturally and professionally to sort of unwind, there's this new twist, which is that a fear, that they've so internalized the fear of what happens if he gets into office again, that they will be punished or retaliated against at a corporate level, that they've also started to say, well, we should, like some sandpaper on the edges. We should maybe smooth out some of the things we're saying so that we're not first in the barrel when they come back. We don't want them to disrupt either our mergers from a parent company or for them to just come at us directly. And so there's a little bit of this go along to get along mentality that's sunk in as well. And I think that's a unique challenge. And I also think that some of it is that because it's so terrifying and scary, many of them don't even acknowledge how much of that has affected their own coverage. And I think you only have to look at not just how they treat Trump, but even how the reporting on Musk has played out. I mean, there's been a fear there too of retaliation and punishment and retribution, and outlets have really changed how they report on what's taking place on X because of a wave of litigation against research organizations, threats against reporters, advertising organizations. Like that just changes the calculus, and I do think it's another twist, and it is affecting behavior.
So interesting, where I thought you were going, and what I've come to believe myself, although it probably comes from the fact that although I have been a straight journalist at times in my life, I come from blogging. And where I thought you were going with journalism being a profession is I think that's actually a problem. I think that journalism being a credentialed profession is one of the reasons why it has the structure that it does. And I've talked about this for so long, is like, remember my therapist one time after a therapy session was like, can I ask you about something else? I was like, yeah, sure. He said, how would you fix journalism? This is during Trump years. And I was like, UBI, universal basic income would help fix journalism, because that would mean that people wouldn't be worried about their jobs. Universal healthcare also. People wouldn't be worried about losing their jobs. So it would create a greater diversity in journalism, because you wouldn't just have like people who come from families with inherited wealth entering into it. And you wouldn't have people who feel like they need to go to journalism school. Like it would just create more voices, which I think would create people who aren't locked into this. First of all, not afraid of losing their job, and also not locked into the system of like false equivalence. Some of the best journalists in American history were non-credentialed.
Not journalists. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whether you look at activist journalism, like Ida B. Wells, or if you look at someone like Harold Ross, who created The New Yorker, who is like never went to college, right? So I don't know how you feel about that, but when people say we're returning to the age of like yellow journalism or whatever, I'm like, yes. Like, well, in a way, like, let's go back to pamphleteering. That's how we founded
totally
America.
Right. I mean, at the heart of it, one of the things that really corrected the era of yellow journalism was that was the same time when yellow journalism died out, and it gets to a UBI point. It was actually at the same time that newspapers' business models changed. They went from selling papers on the streets to subscriptions. And when you went to subscriptions, you had a steady stream of revenue, which then allowed for stability in the industry. And that obviously dissipated the need for yellow journalism or the financial incentive for it, because the business model changed. And there's a lot of differences, but one of the main parallels there, to your point, is the economic part of it, and the way that it is so tethered to individuals' livelihoods, and there's so much decay in the industry now, and there's so much of a lack of resources, funding, that an uncertainty that there isn't even a chance to sort of reassess. And then I think your second point about blogging, and more broadly just that community, what I would just add is that whether it's a set of professional standards or not, I think the key part there are norms. And bloggers at the height of the blogging had a set of norms that they would, that was the whole point of us arguing, right? And that was a big part of it. And I think that's what, in a way, that's what was so great about Twitter before, the current state of it, is that there was a place to sort of let some good things sift through. And if you were somebody that repeatedly posted crappy stuff, or you were less credible, people were less likely to retweet you because they didn't want to get burned. And norms were starting to emerge in the same way that the YouTube community has sort of built their own set of norms. And I think that's, to me, the key part about it, is that there isn't really a place right now for norms to actually sort of incubate and then settle in a way that you could have some reliability and some predictability.
Or at least norms that are based on a value system that that's a humane value system, because norms are developing. They're just, they're bad. They're bad norms.
Yeah. I think they're more like panic responses than norms in some ways. They feel very frantic and hyper focused on individual moments. And that is patterns, very scary to me.
Not norms.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit around Twitter. I know that that's something that you've thought about and looked at a lot. And certainly Elon Musk is a center of gravity in our political universe that is really upsetting.
Yes.
You have a person raised in apartheid who's like the divorced man. Like not we all know. So what's happening there? Like, how has that changed the landscape? And is there stuff that people don't know about that we should be more aware of?
I think that, one of the things that happened on X, I think that's really significant for us, didn't even take place in this country yet, but it's a warning. The same way that Brexit was a little bit of an early warning for us in terms of the influence of like Cambridge Analytica and targeting and all the in the 16 election. Same thing here. One of the things that happened on Twitter recently, not that recently, but maybe a month or so ago, but 6 weeks, is that there was a piece of disinformation, a totally manufactured image. There was a murder in the UK. A 15-year-old girl was killed. A synthetic image, a totally fabricated image, was circulated on Twitter that portrayed Muslims killing this girl, and it took off. It was captured by a bunch of far right extremists, and they took that image as evidence, and then and many of them are now back on Twitter, and so they were able to leverage it, and it just took off like wildfire. It led to riots, even though it was all debunked. It was not challenged, and in fact, it was spread faster and further on Twitter, and then before long, it spread everywhere else. So Twitter was sort of the beachhead for that, and then it took off. Obviously, there was some foreign influence, but you had the combination of Twitter being open season with a already existing extremist organization ready to capitalize on it, and then foreign entities willing to amplify and juice it, and it led to weeks of unrest, civil unrest, riots, violence. It was incredible. And I look at that moment and I connect it back to what's happening right now in our country. And the common denominator is Twitter. I always thought that another beachhead, in order to really start something insidious, you need a beachhead. You need a place to inject it. And then from there, it has to grow and spread. And for a while, that was random websites that most people didn't know about, 4chan or 8chan or Telegram, which are these like communities, chat apps. They were much smaller. And so there was a few steps in between it starting before it really took off. And that means there were more intervention points. And one of the things that Musk has done in particular with Twitter, the two things that I find significant is one, he has rolled back a lot of their policies here. And and stopped a lot of enforcement. And that's not just affected Twitter, it's had a larger effect on the landscape. All the other platforms sort of rolled back a lot of their basic protections too, to sort of align. They went to the lowest common denominator. The second thing he did is he let a lot of people back on that weren't there. Laura Loomer was somebody that wasn't on Twitter up until recently because he let her back on. And so that's a bad combination for us in the next few weeks because he is he's like a red pill Pez dispenser. And because he is the decision maker there and we are heading into such a unique moment, you can really see a scenario where the exact same process that I described plays out, but instead of it being about a 15-year-old girl, it's about a ballot box, a ballot drop-off station, right?
Right. Or it's about Haitian immigrants, which again,
correct.
Like let's just say Black people.
Yep. Yeah.
And it has been mainstream to the point they talk about it on Fox News, you know. It is the fucking vice presidential candidate who has admitted that the story is kind of iffy, still says there's a layer of truth. There have been these bomb threats, that have been called in, and, conservative or Republican mayors saying stop. The person who originally posted the information saying stop, which, and people are I think people could die. Like I honestly do. I think we could see lynchings basically from this.
I think what if you just look at the through line in terms of what types of outside entities have been activated. And I use this as a representation, but it just shows what the stakes are. In 2016, the outside force was bikers for Trump. It was a bunch of middle-aged guys who rode bikes, and then they added a patch. And I'm not diminishing, but they were biker groups, not gangs, biker groups. And they kind of seemed scary because bikes are loud and they had leather, but honestly, they were cosplaying. They were bikers for Trump. And that was like their show of force, right? In 2020, it got more serious with Proud Boys. And they were more violent. And then obviously as a representation, January 6th, right? There was a lot more individuals there ready to go. If you look at what's happened between now and then, the outside entities are literally paramilitary neo-Nazi organizations. They're marching. Patriot Front, which is a neo-Nazi group, they marched in Ohio after this story and partly in response to this, right, as a show of force. So to your point, I don't think we should diminish it. One of the things that Trump has done, and by extension, what's happening with Twitter and some other platforms, they're sort of the conduit for it, is that he is organizing power on what used to be considered the fringes. And when you do that, you bring in figures that are not engaging in basic democratic principles or even accepting those rules. They operate with a different set of standards. That's why we're typically on the fringes. And I think the stakes are higher because the individuals that play, and obviously then there's this larger set of masses that are just so hopped up, but they have this ends justify the means mentality. And to me, the best example I could see is Kyle Rittenhouse. The guy killed someone and became a millionaire as a result of it, right? Because they thought it was justifiable.
I think we need to mention the assassination attempts if we're going to talk about violence. Not to diminish them at all, but it does seem clear to me that the first attempt was someone seeking fame. It's clear from his searches he would have gone after anyone that would have put him on the front page. The second attempt seems to be someone who identifies with Democrats. I don't want to speak. I think it's unclear. Like, I won't say anything more about that except that he did give money, right? There has been a call for, again, our vice presidential candidate to stop this violent rhetoric. Now,
I think that they, and it's, he is a small reflection of what's happening every minute across the right-wing media segment, which is that everybody needs to be prepared to take matters into their own hands, that the official government agencies, they talk about the attempted would-be sort of shooter, but they talk about him as if he is a member of the CIA and a member of the Biden administration who was sort of sent there and dispatched. I mean, they just presume that he's a member of the government. They don't even try to draw a distinction now. And that's the part that's so scary, is that when Vance sort of talks about that rhetoric, one, he's asking everyone to just stop calling them for what they are, which is extremist. But two, he is reinforcing this larger narrative that's bubbling up in the parts of the right wing now, which is that they're going to keep coming at Trump. And by they mean the government. They mean these shadowy forces, Democrats, and that you need to be prepared to do something to defend him and to defend yourself. And that they're adding fuel to the fire, and they're getting people sort of prepared and amped up. And that to me is the part that is scary, is that they see this. They see, the beginning, the embers, and instead of throwing some dust on it or just ignoring it, which would also be an option too. They don't have to they're putting more fuel on the fire. They're sort of helping amp it up because they know that that's something they can harness. And that worries me a lot, because it gets back to your point about potential would-be violence. They're building an ends justify the means case.
I don't want to believe that I'm being defensive here, or that I'm pushing back against false equivalence where maybe there is some equivalence. But I think even if you give some ground to the second assassination attempt, if you say clearly he identified as a Democrat, clearly like there's something that he was reacting to on that side, what we can point to as a difference, and I think a measurable objective difference, is the reaction of the people on that side to what happened, right? And the kind of rhetoric that is used around it. Whereas on the right, you do have, they're coming for you. Like, that assassination attempt is proof that they're coming. That's what you were talking about. They're coming for you. They are coming for you. Whereas on the left, I think you have condemnation. You have, we don't want to ever have this reaction. And I think importantly, when we talk on the left about what you can do to oppose the right, we talk about the ballot box.
Yeah.
We don't talk
they
about
talk about the Second Amendment. Yeah, exactly. They talk about the Second Amendment. And, I think like even things that don't seem as concerning as they should be are. So like even yesterday, Ron DeSantis making an announcement that he's going to have the state prosecutor look into charges and that's their jurisdiction, and then taking a swipe at the FBI and the DOJ, basically saying they shouldn't be the ones leading this investigation because they're out to get Trump too. They're all validating this broader narrative and that's what I think we should not discount, is that there is, for a very long time, the major story has always been that the reason you need your gun is because one day you're going to have to use it either against violent gangs or the government, most likely the government. I mean, that is the story they tell themselves about why they need to be armed, is either some violent effort against their home or the government. And this right now is really helping amp that up, and I know they know what they're doing. They're doing it on purpose. And the story about him is they should realize this storyline is a lot more complicated than just like, oh, it's clearly somebody who was motivated to get Harris elected. That I don't think that's what was happening here. I think it was somebody that he's very much focused on Ukraine and foreign legion stuff and had complicated, weird politics. And it's certainly not something that was set up by Biden or Harris to take out Trump, right? But that is the whiff of what they're reinforcing. And when you combine it all together, it is they sort of, and I think this to me is the final bow on all of this, is that one of the things that happened in 2020 is that led up to January 6th is that was sort of a scrambling sort of last ditch effort to sort of hold on to power. And whereas this time around, something more extraordinary is not going to be a last ditch effort. It's actually like a pre-identified coherent backup plan. And I think that's what the difference is here, is that last time it was highly responsive and they were just sort of grabbing at anything that they could grab at and sort of in an effort to sort of overturn it. This time it's different. Like there's a lot more of a coordinated effort to ensure one way or the other that Trump gets elected. And I think that's the part when you tie what the way that they're responding to this in with this broader sort of effort around the election, it does, I think, reinforce your point about violence. I think it does. I think the calculus is really different this time around, and I'm mostly worried about that.
I think there's reason to be worried. I think we've covered it. That particular point. So before we wrap up, I want to make sure, is there anything else you wanted to get to? Final thoughts? Something we haven't gotten to?
I think to me, no, I mean, to me, the bigger thing is that, and I guess that's the one thing that I look at, not just in the next few months, but on the horizon, is that for the last 30 years or so, the landscape has been mostly static, and there hasn't been much of a, you can change it on the edges. You can change the balance between how big and influential the larger right-wing media apparatus was. You can maybe blunt some of the impacts of and the effects of the echo chamber. But this is really the first time in decades where it's almost like we have a do-over. There wasn't anyone in the 90s as talk radio was sort of taking over and changing our culture and our politics, and Fox News was born. And those two things together really changed our country in meaningful ways. They changed the way information was distributed. They changed our politics. They changed our culture. They changed our values. We haven't really there wasn't anything then to say, wait, this is going to change us. We need to think about this and we need to anticipate it. We have a chance now. We have a do-over. There is a do-over. We are sort of at this inflection moment. There is so much change happening in the information landscape, and you sort of referenced it before, that even I think the next few months are significant as they relate to the election, but then more broadly, the period that we're in right now is kind of going to set the stage for what the next few decades look like. And I think that we shouldn't lose sight of that in this moment, because it is significant. And that's where thinking about how people get their news and information, how they participate in that, is way more significant than I think than it's been for a really long time. And that's the thing that sort of keeps me moving too.
It's such a wonderful, clear place to end, but I have to reflect something back at you, which is the opportunity here is not just, the do-over is not just whether or not there is a Rush Limbaugh to respond to.
Yeah.
It is that the complete structure has changed. Because I do think the left for a long time was like, we need our Limbaugh, right?
Yeah.
And that didn't work. I think that has kind of something to do with the mentality of people on the left and what the value system is of people on the left. But now there are no more Limbaughs, period, right? And so the opportunity comes in just a different landscape, not just like pulling the mountain over to our side.
Right.
Like it comes in the fact that the mountain is getting leveled. That mountain of mainstream media is like crumbling. What does that different landscape look like? Like how, when we get the do-over, what is the landscape that you envision?
I think that it is, and I think you're seeing this play out, like we talked about before, a little bit with the Harris campaign, where there's a lot more comfort engaging with smaller audiences, or seemingly smaller audiences. Some of them are bigger than any of the more mainstream audiences, and but engaging with different segments and doing it in authentic and real ways. And I also think it ties into the funding too, which is that the right wing invested in their creators as they sort of worked their way up, and so there was apparatuses being built into that echo chamber And I think more broadly, when the left is thinking about their larger funding efforts, I mean, we spend billions of dollars on political ads that we know nobody's watching. And if they take a fraction of that money and just give it to creators who already exist but are just doing things on the side, we would have a fundamentally different information landscape, right? I mean, it's
Can I volunteer?
isn't that crazy? Like, it's like we know, and like they're going to spend billions of dollars, and they know the ads don't work. Like they're like, well, we know they don't work, but they work a little, maybe, but a fraction of that has a significantly larger return. So that's what I think it looks like. Is that it's a reorientation not just to audiences, but also to the way that the money in the system also thinks about how it's distributed and where the return on investment is. And I think that's something that ultimately is either going to happen, in which case we're going to be able to take advantage of this moment, or it's not, and Democrats are going to see continuing diminishing returns on their political investments over time until they're not able to sustain.
Right. What a perfect place to end, with an ad.
Yeah.
This is 90 Days with Autumn Reed Cox. There are 47 days left till the election. Again, many conservative states stop voter registration at 30 days. So 19 days to register. Please look into registering if you haven't already. Please check and see if you're registered, because some of those states are kicking people off the rolls without them knowing. So check that out. And then also, if you want to be a part of changing the landscape of our media ecosystem and giving more power to a value system that's more progressive, consider giving money to this show or by subscribing, by clicking the links down under if you're watching on YouTube, subscribing via wherever you get your podcasts that way, because we are both a podcast and a YouTube channel. And I want to thank President and CEO of Media Matters for America, Angelo Carusone, for being with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope that we will have more inclusive approach, as it is the value of America, a land of the free where human rights should be respected, no matter where you come from, regardless of your skin color. So I am optimistic that if we understand in humanity, we're going to have a more peaceful community here in Springfield.